Hey, what is up guys, it's Larry with the Financial Lift, and today we're going to be talking about whether or not it makes more sense to build an emergency fund first, or whether it makes more sense to pay off any debt that you may have. And when it comes to, a financial journey and being more financially healthy, I think a lot of people tend to overcomplicate things, and it just becomes this daunting experience. They have a lot of questions, which is understandable, but then it ends up making people just kind of check out altogether. So what I hope to accomplish is give my own personal thoughts on whether or not it makes, there are definitely times where it does make more sense to pay off debt first. And there are definitely times where it does make more sense to build an emergency fund first. And I really hope by giving my own thoughts and advice, it will help others out there stay on their financial journey. And to start, it really helps to think about the overall purpose of an emergency fund. It's really there so that way you have the money to be able to pay for, a major car repair, for example, or a medical expense, or maybe you just end up unemployed. That money is available to you. That way you don't have to necessarily go into debt, or at least further into debt in some cases, especially when you consider that a credit card interest rate can be as high as 22%. But here's the thing, if you're already in debt, then this whole point about a 22% interest rate is not necessarily as valid anymore. Just thinking about it this way, if you spend $1,000 right now to pay off some credit card debt, only to end up having tomorrow to use that same credit card to pay for a major expense of $1,000, then you're really no better off or worse off than you were if you had just saved $1,000 and not paid off that credit card and then used that $1,000 to pay off a major expense. Now, the counter argument to all of this would be that in some cases, it actually is more beneficial and saves you money by having a $1,000 emergency fund versus having to use debt. For example, if you're at an auto repair shop, a lot of these shops will end up giving you a bigger discount if you end up offering to pay cash. Instead of a $1,000 charge to a credit card, they end up only charging $800 because you're willing to pay cash. And on top of that, a lot of places end up charging, processing fees for credit cards or having to use some form of debt to make a payment. So that ends up saving you money by having that $1,000 emergency fund. So that's a good example of when it makes sense to fund your emergency fund first before paying off any debt. Another good example would be when credit cards or debt is not necessarily the best option or even an available option to pay. For example, if you're unemployed and you lose your job and you don't necessarily have the cash to pay rent, it's not as easy to use a credit card to pay rent. So that's where it may make more sense to have that cash available, because that can end up, being the difference between having a place to stay at or not. So when would you ever pay off debt instead of funding your emergency fund first? Well, a good situation would be if, for example, your emergency fund is mostly there for, a backup in case you get unemployed, not necessarily because you have any major repairs coming up anytime soon. You have a good, reliable car. And on top of that, the debt you do have is a really high interest rate, at 22 or 25% interest rate. It may actually be pretty beneficial, and it will save you money by paying that debt off first, which by saving money ends up meaning that you can build your emergency fund a lot quicker. Another type of example would be if your debt relates to kind of a family member, for example. You took out a loan or you borrowed money from parents, and it's just kind of causing a strain on the relationship, and you kind of want to get out of the situation as quickly as possible, so that way you can kind of start to think and feel more independent. You're in more control of your own life. So that may be a situation where it makes more sense to pay off the debt first rather than build that emergency fund. And probably the last example I would give is if you're the type of person to stress more about, being in debt versus the type of people that are more stressed about not having any money in their savings. I'm kind of the belief that finances is partly a mental game. So you have to kind of understand your mental weaknesses and your mental strengths. So once again, if you're the type of person to stress more about debt, that's going to end up making you less productive, less motivated to kind of build an emergency fund, less motivated to pay off debt. So if you can kind of eliminate that by paying off the debt first, that may build momentum, and that may be to your benefit. So the reverse can end up being the same too. If you're the type of person that really stresses when you see your bank account at that $10 mark, or, you open up a bank statement and it says you have $0 in your bank account, that can be a situation where it makes more sense to build an emergency fund first rather than paying off debt. In the end, it kind of nets the same if you pay off the $1,000 in debt or end up having a $1,000 emergency fund and not paying off the debt. But the point I'm trying to get at is that it really is a mental game, and you have to consider which is going to motivate you more. Now, one possible recommendation that doesn't always work with everyone, but does work with some people, is to open up a credit card that has a 0% interest for like 15 months or 12 months. It's kind of a promotional period. And especially if they have a 0%, balance transfer, they don't necessarily charge you a fee for transferring over other credit cards to that new balance. And that can be beneficial because it kind of gives you kind of the best of both worlds. You can build an emergency fund over those 12 months or 15 months while at the same time, you're not necessarily being penalized for not paying off that debt. So it can kind of be the best of both worlds, but there's a good chance, in some cases that you don't necessarily have good enough credit to qualify for that credit card. So it's not necessarily an option, but if it is an option, it's definitely something worth looking into. Now, in the end, when it comes to paying off debt or building an emergency fund, I personally believe that it really shouldn't matter, especially if you're a person that's motivated to get financially healthy and you're paying off debt or you're wanting to build an emergency fund. If you're really motivated, in the end, you're going to accomplish both goals, so it really shouldn't matter. But I would say, to kind of give a definitive answer on which one I would recommend going with, me personally, I tend to go with building an emergency fund first, mostly because I believe if you have the discipline to even start building an emergency fund in the first place, then I kind of hope that you have the discipline to not be the type of person to look at your bank account, see that you have $500 in there, and feel like you're justifying buying a $300 jacket. Am I being a little too optimistic though? On top of that, when you kind of think about that, most people on average are driving between a 4 to 7-year-old car. And so they're usually having to spend, they're having more and more major repairs. And on average, the average major repair costs anywhere from $500 to $800. Then it really makes sense to have that cash on hand, especially because auto shops, really value having cash on hand. So if you're able to pay, upfront the full amount, you're probably going to be able to negotiate a better discount than you would if you were paying on a credit card. Now, if you need any motivation to help build that emergency fund, just consider this, that if you save $20 per week, it would only take a year to fund a $1,000 emergency fund, which, to some people, a year may seem like a long time. But, if you're talking about having lived under the burden of debt and not having an emergency fund for the past 5 to 10 years, then 1 year to be on the right financial path is really not that long. And if you can just get to $20 per week, just consider this. If you just push yourself even just a little bit further, just an extra $10, then at $30 per week, then it would only take about 8 months to build a $1,000 emergency fund. So in the end, I really do wish the best for everybody as far as being able to pay off debt and building that emergency fund. And I sincerely hope this video at least helped one person out there. And if you appreciate this video, all I ask in return is just give it a thumbs up. It would really help me out a lot. And if you like personal finance or anything business or money related, I post a video pretty much every other day. So please hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more.